This is a lecture on World War I and American participation in the First World War. In previous lectures, we've discussed what caused the Great War as it was known at the time. We've discussed what was the great killing agents of that war, including but not limited to artillery, the machine gun, poison gas delivered by artillery, and various and sundry other weapons, but those were the main ones. Additionally, though not mentioned in the previous lecture, you'll also see the introduction of tanks, airplanes, and submarines into now usage in the First World War. Of the three, the submarine was the most effective, followed by the airplane, particularly as you get toward the end of the war in 1918. And last but not least, the tank was in its infancy, along with the internal combustion engine, and so that prevented the tank from playing a decisive role on the battlefield in almost every major engagement. The fact is, however, by 1917, the Allies, or the Triple Entente, is a worn out and seemingly on its last legs. Germany seems to have gotten the upper hand in the First World War by this point in time. The flames of revolution have struck in Russia and have knocked Russia out of the war, and will bring on the Russian Revolution, particularly that of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and they will take control through their master and their leader, Vladimir Lenin, in 1917, and later will consolidate power under Lenin and later Stalin, and will be the Soviet Union. But one of the things that they do to get out of the war, and Lenin's basic promise to the workers was, and to anybody who would support the Bolsheviks, was the fact that if they came to power and they were given power by the people, and I use that loosely, making it sound like it was some sort of democratic thing, because it wasn't. But if they got power, they said they'd get out of the war, and they did. It was the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. It is going to sign over massive portions of Western Russia, the Belarusia, and so forth, massive territories to the Germans that would have greatly enlarged Imperial Germany had Germany won the First World War. But in a more military standpoint, in 1917, with the collapse of the Russians, and the end of that phase of the war, Germany could now turn its attention and fight a one front war against the French and the British, particularly. In some German circles, in many German circles, the thinking is that France was like a sword in the hands of the British, and that France could be shattered finally with one heavy blow. You're looking at probably close to 1 million soldiers, soldatens from Germany, going westward to fight into the Western Front and the Western trenches. Reality is that with regard to the collapse of Russia, puts extreme pressure on the French and the British, and they are desperate to see some sort of American intervention or some sort of deliverance, because frankly, under the hammer blows of the Germans, even though Germany had been ground down itself by the war, Germany is not made up of supermen. But the fact is that it has been ground down, but it's still probably got a better army than the French, and the French army had mutinied in 1917. So the Germans, in their calculations for winning the war once and for all, are going to make the calculation that in 1917 they were going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare and try to cripple American trade coming into Britain. Now, the United States in 1914, 1915 had declared itself neutral, but in reality, the economic trade between the United States and Great Britain, especially to a lesser degree France, was far superior to that of anything that got through the British blockade to Germany. Had American suppliers tried to supply Germany, they frankly could not have gotten through the blockade. So, in a sense, the United States really had no other trading partner but that of the British. Plus, the fact is that by 1914, 15, 16, you can make the argument that the Americans, the Wilson administration particularly, was enthralled to and was in favor of and supportive of the Allied cause, the British and the French, because of commonalities and so forth. But long and the short of it is that Germany is in fairly dire straits. And so one of the things that the Germans are going to do as they try to win the war is to start sinking and putting as much cargo ships to the bottom as possible. This is going to be a major reason for the U.S. entry into World War I. Americans, students especially nowadays, want to think that one of the reasons we got into the war was because of the sinking of the Lusitania. This Lusitania was a ship, a luxury liner, a British ship in 1915. It was put to the bottom, but it was stuffed to the gills with weapons of war plus 1,000 plus passengers. So when it gets sunk off the coast of Ireland in 1915, it goes down very quickly. I think it's all of about 16, 17 minutes. For the type of blast that hit it and where it was hit, it should not have gone down for more anything less than an hour, and maybe more like an hour and a half. The idea would be is that it had plenty enough time to deploy lifeboats. The problem was is that it was so laden down with weapons of war. It frankly, the British were in essence gambling with the lives of 1,000 plus people, that the Germans wouldn't have the sands to put a ship to the bottom. That was seemingly a civilian ship. Never mind the fact that it was filled with weapons of war. But the Germans in 1915 did put it to the bottom. It caused an international incident. The Wilson administration condemned the Germans. Not everybody in Wilson's administration was comfortable with that setup, one of which was the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who was a bit of a pacifist, to be honest about it. But he was also, I think, right when he said is that the people who got onto the Lusitania, a British flagged ship, meaning it's a British ship, were warned and warned in New York newspapers and other newspapers by the imperial government that by getting on a flagship of Britain, you were taking, in a sense, your life into your own hands. If you get caught by a torpedo, you get caught by a torpedo. You may get through, but be forewarned. So, in essence, I would argue that Secretary of State Bryan was just simply, I think, being probably fairly honest in the fact and saying that these folks kind of knew what they were getting. But it made for great copy, and it was a tragedy. No two ways about that, at least on the human side. And so a lot of Americans were reinforced with that idea of German barbarity and German butchery. The bloody Hun might be another way to say it. The reality is that with the British, they were also pretty good at the propaganda as well. We got to remember when we talk about American entry into the First World War, the United States was being fed a large amount of British propaganda about German atrocities and the way they handled Belgium and other places. Now, the German army was not messing with kid gloves. I'm not here to say that. But I am saying is that the rape of Belgium, as it was often called, the rape of Belgium was an overblown event that was designed to basically turn the Germans into bloodthirsty, primitive knuckle draggers compared to the freedom-loving Brits and so forth. The British knew, because perhaps just having watched us over the years, knew Americans love a good sob story. And also, I'd argue, too, is that they also needed us to get into the war. And they wanted us because of the economic might, the numerical numbers we could bring to the forefront, and so forth. So the British are going to play up everything possible. Basically, that the German soldiers, as they passed through Belgium, raped women and children, that they slit the throats of children. It was a barbaric affair, that they just slaughtered whole towns, and it was a full-blown disaster. A kind of a presage of World War II, when the Germans clearly were bloodthirsty in the final solution and things, frankly, before that, in the late 1930s in Russia, Poland, and places beyond. So I think it's worth remembering is that the British are going to help try to pump full of into the American mind how horrible the Germans were. It, by the way, has an impact upon World War II, is that a lot of Americans in the 1930s are going to be very much isolationist, because by the 1930s, American entry and participation in the First World War, was considered by many a mistake, and that those atrocities were never quite as gruesome, barbaric, or widespread as they were made out to be, and therefore were not reliable barometers of what the Germans were up to. So in 1936, 37, 38, 39 even, when you hear people screaming that the Nazis are barbarous, they are ghoulish, they are nasty, a lot of Americans would just simply say, especially after the Second World War begins, that yeah, it's just more British propaganda trying to suck our boys back into another European war to get them killed like they did in the First World War. Americans in 1939, 1940 have a very cynical view of the Europeans in general and claims of barbarity in particular. So that was part of the reason why we stay out of the war, arguably anyways, as long as we do. But the fact of the matter is the British had also cut cable traffic coming out of Germany and across the transatlantic cable, which was at that time the major means of communication with the old world, with the continent. You had no satellites in 1917 or 1918, and so realistically, you got only what came through the cable. Which, of course, the British, if they cut the German cable, you're not going to read German newspapers. You're not going to read German cable traffic. You're going to get a British and a French-eyed view. The German Navy just simply was not strong enough and good enough to really challenge the British on the high seas, despite the building program of the first decade of the 20th century. So we Americans got a heavy, heavy dose of propaganda. And one of the things that we found out is that the British were not invincible, and more particularly is that they were in dire straits. After we get into the war, it wasn't propaganda so much, but it was a true fact that what we find out when we declare war on Germany in April of 1917, and we go and get kind of read into the situation in Britain, is that unrestricted submarine warfare that the Germans had unleashed in 1917 to win the war. And perhaps even if that provoked America into a war, that would be ignored. Excuse me, that would be, let me back up here a second. If the unrestricted submarine warfare of Germany provoked the United States into declaring war on Germany, Germany thought that they could win the war before we could organize an army and send them across the ocean. And so when we got over in April or May, June of 1917, to start talking and coordinating strategy with the British basically say, look, we have food for X amount of months. I think it was like 1 month, maybe 8 weeks perhaps. In addition to that, we have supplies, just general civilian supplies that are just dwindled down to nothing. We are in trouble. We need help badly. And so there was a great privation in Britain, to say the least. The German U-boat campaign was successful. In addition to that, Germany itself, I think it's worth remembering, is starving as well. And so what German propaganda that did get floated around and sent to America to try to keep America out of the war, one of the things you see German propagandists are going to say is that, okay, to their American audience, and Germans were never as good as the British as far as propaganda is concerned. But if you want to see what it'd be like for your boy to fight in the war, go dig a hole in the backyard, fill it full of mud and water, and have your boy camp out in it all night long. That's like what it's like to be in a trench in the British Army, or it would be like a trench. You don't want your boy into that. And at least early on, it was somewhat successful, because I think it's worth noting culturally in America in 1914, 1915, one of the most prominent songs in that time period, and the most favorite song of the early General War period, say 14 and 15, is I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. When you're singing songs entitled I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, that's pretty good indicative that you are against the war. And there were a lot of Americans in 1914 and 15 were against it. It's not unfair to remember, too, is that you have in 1914 and 15 a lot of Americans who are just simply German descent. Giesenschlags, we weren't sympathizers with Germany, to my knowledge, but we were German, and there were a lot of others who may have been more sympathetic to Germany than to Britain. And so that's worth remembering. And it was certainly remembered by the Wilson administration. People talk a lot about diversity, but the United States was amazingly diverse with all those new immigrants. And in 1914-15, heck, even in 17 and 18, when the war is going on for America, the question is, will all these immigrants, whether they're the first generation or the second generation, will they be true to their new country, the United States, or will they have an affinity that supersedes or trumps their allegiance to the United States? Will they have an affinity for the old world? Will they love Russia better? Will they love Austria better? Will they love Germany better? Or will they love America better? And so that was those were all questions that are going to be dealt with and argued about in the United States. And so America, does, at least at first, does not really want to get into the war. In fact, you can see this in the rhetoric coming out of the Wilson administration. President Woodrow Wilson, on several occasions, is going to say variations off of the same theme, but basically is that we Americans are neutral and we're staying out of the war. And so if we are neutral and staying out of the war, what we need to do then is that we need to have to be not only neutral in action, but in mind. And that was that idea, I think, that Wilson is trying to spread, this idea that we, because of the diversity, because of the uncertainty of this diverse nation, will they follow the flag of the home country, the new or the immigrant country? Well, the idea basically is that we're going to stay out. You'll also see that Wilson makes statements that to me sound foolish, perhaps to you as well, maybe not. Too proud to fight. That was one of Wilson's early pronouncements. Too proud to fight. A nation that is too proud to fight. Almost that militant pacifism, if you like. And then Wilson's also going to use a phrase that Theodore Roosevelt sneered at, and it was called watchful waiting. Watchful waiting. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was a warmonger, who wanted to relive glory again and believed very much that war was good for the soul, almost in a theological sense. He called it willful watching because Roosevelt wanted to take the United States to war right away. In fact, actually, Wilson in 1916 is going to run on a platform of he kept us out of war. So he was the peace candidate, arguably, in 1916's presidential election. The Republicans, it was a close election. In 1916, it was so close, in fact, that was it Charles Evans Hughes, I believe it was, who ran against Wilson. Wilson won only because Evans Hughes lost California. The state of California in 2018 is a state that is extremely Democratic. I mean, it's as Democratic as, say, Alabama is Republican normally. And so it takes perhaps a miracle for a Republican to win in it, aside from a couple of places, but for a statewide candidate to win in California today. But in 1916 America, California was not a Democratic bastion and citadel. California in 1916 was arguably, and I think it's true, was a Republican state. We don't have time to get into California politics as how they switch in 100 years, but that was a state that clearly should have been carried, or at least could have been carried by the Republican. But I believe, like I said, it was Charles Evans Hughes, is going to make an enemy of the wrong man or two in California, and these boss-type characters will tell their people to vote for Wilson. And those votes, it's only several thousand. I think it's about 20,000 votes, maybe 10 even. My point is this, is the razor blade margin by which Wilson carries California is so close that it just would have been, had the Republican minded his P's and Q's better, he carries California, and through the Electoral College, plus probably the popular vote, he is going to be made president of the United States. But Wilson wins. He wins on a peace platform. He's still president for a second term. So what gets the United States into the war? The reality is what gets us into the war is this one, unrestricted submarine warfare, knocking out not only British ships, but now American cargo ships, and sending tons and tons and hundreds, if not thousands of lives to the bottom. You're also going to see in the United States, and particularly like in New York City at the docks, you're going to see some sabotage by the Germans. I think it was called the Black Dan bombing, but it was in 1916 there as well. So that had a little bit of a hand to play. Destroyed large part of, or at least some of the wharves there in New York's harbor. But in addition to that fact, the reality is that there's going to be more to the story of bringing the United States into the war than just simply unrestricted submarine warfare. Perhaps the United States was warming in a general sense towards supporting the Allied British, French cause and getting into the war that way. But I think the thing that helps push Americans, particularly of Middle America, over the top, and to get Americans who frankly, are not going to be worried about submarine attacks in Kansas. Get them over the top would be stuff that takes place in Mexico. In previous lectures and in your textbook, it is referenced in that 1910, Mexico had suffered through or started into another round of revolution and civil war. Mexico's been a turbulent nation for much of its existence, politically anyways, a turbulent nation. That in 1910, you're going to have various characters trying to get out in front and perhaps get American assistance in the ongoing the Mexican Revolution. The reality is that one of the individuals, Pancho Villa, that's a man's name you probably ought to remember. Pancho Villa looks like by the time you get to 1915, 16, he is in eclipse. His star had faded and his Northern Army was just not doing what it had been. In revolutions sometimes, and frankly war, if you look like you're yesterday's news, that the tide's flowing away from you, to use a nautical term or maritime term, it's not good. And in 1916, old Pancho Villa felt like he'd been betrayed by the Wilson administration. In some respects, Wilson had played footsie with him, but Wilson had gone on with it and jumped into bed with other Mexican politicians, figuratively speaking, and was basically had thrown or cast Pancho Villa aside. Well, Villa was desperate. He looked like he was desperate. He was upset. He was mad. He was ruthless, frankly. He was a bit of a bandito. And he is going to cross on several occasions, most famously at Columbus, New Mexico. Columbus, New Mexico. You probably ought to write that down. Because Columbus, New Mexico is an American town. Years ago, one of the famous statements about Americans not knowing geography was a fellow from New Mexico called up in 1996, called up the IOC, not the IOC, the U.S. Olympic Committee, and tried to buy tickets to the Atlanta Games in 1996. Well, the person on the phone said, where are you from? And he said, well, I'm from Albuquerque. I think it was Albuquerque. It could have been Santa Fe. But he said, I'm from so-and-so, New Mexico. And the man on the other line, the ticket taker, said, no, you have to call through your home country's Olympic committee to get tickets. And the fellow said, no, I'm an American. I'm from New Mexico. And the fellow would hear none of it. He would hear none of it. Finally, the fellow said, fine. Send it to my house. I've got another house in Arizona. And the ticket taker said, oh, sure, okay, I got you now. You're an American. Great, no problem. But had no clue that New Mexico was a state in the Union. New Mexico was a new state in the Union in 1916. New Mexico was an American state, is an American state, and American blood, about 20 people were killed on American soil by an attacking army, loosely using that term, but an attacking army led by Pancho Villa into Columbus, New Mexico as punishment and as a strike back against Wilson's treachery and perfidy. The fact is that even today, had an army crossed into American territory and killed 20, 30, 50, 100 people, whatever, in American territory, I would like to think that today there would be this response from Americans that, oh my gosh, how can America be attacked on its soil? We must crush and destroy those who would attack us on our homeland. It's not unreasonable. And the Wilson administration responded in force. He sends approximately half to three-quarters of the U.S. Army down into Mexico chasing after Pancho Villa. One of the individuals who's down that part of the way is the commanding officer of that little operation. His name is John J. Pershing. John J. Pershing. Now, Pershing is a ramrod straight, hard as nails sort of guy. He's made hard. He was always kind of rough around the edges, but he loved his wife and kids, but he was made very hard by the fact that as he was an adult, I think he was about 45 or so when it took place, a little older than I am, maybe 50 almost. Well, he had 4 kids with his wife, who was a good number of years his junior. Well, anyways, it was evidently a very loving relationship. The wife and kids were living out in San Francisco, California, at one of the army bases there in San Francisco. John J. Pershing, the father, the husband, the general. This about 1912, 1913. Actually, may have been 14. But anyways, he's in El Paso, Texas, or around El Paso, doing patrol, doing field work. He was doing army work as a colonel or captain in the army. And long and the short of it is that while there, I say he was a captain. He was actually a brigadier general then. There's a bit of a jump in his status. He gets jumped over about 800 officers to be made a brigadier general. I think that had already happened. Well, anyways, it happens to him, and he's out in the field, and while he's doing his duty as a soldier, their house back in San Francisco, California, catches on fire, and Pershing's family dies, with the exception of a boy, dies in the inferno. I think they died of smoke inhalation. They didn't get charred, but it killed the kids and killed most of the kids and killed the wife, and he was never the same again. But John J. Pershing is going to be your commander running through Mexico trying to chase down Pancho Villa. Doesn't get anywhere. He basically, at best you could say, is he scatters Villa's army. And while down there, Villa really becomes a folk hero in Mexico. Even to this day, people will know Pancho Villa because of his activities, having stuck the finger in the Yankee eye, and he was able to live and tell the tale. Well, the reason I bring up Pancho Villa, Pershing, and all that isn't just because Pershing is an important individual, and he is. Villa has this will when you talk about and you know about the Villa situation with New Mexico and Columbus and those raids and so forth, and the war with Mexico, or the quasi war with Mexico. What I'm about to say next makes sense about converting a lot of other Americans into a war fever against the Germans. One of the things that the Germans were not terribly good at was, and this is true for both world wars, I would argue, is their diplomacy at times was often clumsy, not well thought out. It just at times they were much more efficient and great engineers, but diplomacy, maybe not. Well, the Germans sent a telegram. It's called the Zimmermann note, or the Zimmermann telegram, to the Zimmermann's the diplomat in charge in Mexico, basically, and sends a note down to Mexico City saying that if Mexico will involve itself in a war with the United States, that after the war is over and Germany and Mexico win the war, then Texas and California, New Mexico and Utah and all those states lost in the war, Texas War for Independence, the Mexican Cession, and so forth, all those territories would be given back to Mexico, and Mexico would be made whole again if Mexico would involve itself in a war with the United States, tying the United States down and keeping it out of the European theater for all intents and purposes. Now, reality is that the Mexicans basically, as I understand it, laughed it off and said, that's not a tiger we wish to tangle with again. And so it didn't get anywhere. Now, the Mexicans did not release that telegram to us, but back to the old British, the old crafty British. Remember, Napoleon said about the British that they were a treacherous group. He called them Albion, perfidious Albion. And old Churchill, even in later years, will make the remark about espionage and so forth. He says is that the truth has to be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies, or something to that effect anyhow. Well, long and the short of it is that the British had been reading our cable traffic for months, if not years, and they had been they knew everything that we knew before we knew it. Even old Wilson trying to cover up and to protect communications between him and diplomats and him and generals and him and this and that. Wilson's efforts, the American government's efforts at I guess you could say concealing our diplomatic thinking throughout the system was a joke. The British cracked it in an instance, and they read our mail, they read our traffic, they knew what we were thinking. I can see Wilson trying to cipher and decipher notes, and the British had already had it. So they had tapped our cable traffic, they had tapped the line, and they were reading our mail. And one of the things they read was that Zimmermann note. The British read it and they knew it. Knew it evidently about a week to 10 days before we did. And what they were trying to figure out is how can we pass this through channels without the Americans becoming aware of them, of their compromise, the Americans being compromised in their secrecy and their diplomacy. Because in an essence, perhaps it might be a stretch, but sometimes it can do these things. But reading another nation's cable traffic and can be perhaps considered an act of war, perhaps certainly wouldn't be considered a friendly action anyhow. Probably an act of war is a bit of a stretch on my part, but certainly it's not a friendly action. Well, they passed the Zimmerman note on to us. We believed the story that they'd concocted for us, and it was everywhere that the Mexicans and more particularly the Germans were trying to dismantle the United States, and that brought out those feelings of patriotism, that feelings of desire to strike a blow, to defend American honor, to work and to go. Wilson was swept up into the to the war fever as well. He sits down and writes one of the most stirring pieces of prose that is ever delivered by an American president. And he wrote it himself. He was really a great writer. He knew how to handle the English language. And he talks about making the world safe for democracy, a very idealistic, and I think that word ought to be applied to Wilson, a very idealistic way of trying to handle and to promote world affairs through the eyes of the United States. We must, it is a fearful thing to take a proud nation like the United States into war, but the world must be made safe for democracy, as he goes on and says. On April, let's see, what was it, April 2nd, Wilson delivers his war message to the U.S. Congress. On April 6th, 1917, the United States declares war on Germany, Austria, Hungary, and so forth. And the fact is that war is now in earnest, and now you've got to build an army. And so that's now we turn the United States from a peaceful footing now to a full-blown war footing. The United States had been making supplies for some time and had been making supplies especially for the British, but now we need it for an American army. In the Spanish-American War, you could realistically say the United States could get away with 200,000 soldiers under arms to fight the Spanish down in Cuba and elsewhere. Maybe even 125,000 would do the trick. And you could get by in the Spanish-American War with volunteers. But it was obvious almost from the get-go that the United States needed a far larger army to fight in the First World War. We're not talking armies of thousands, we're talking armies of millions. And the idea basically was that the United States was going to have an army somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 million people. It was going to be the biggest army ever put into the field in American history to that time. And so we've got to have men, and we don't have time for recruitment and filling the ranks only that way. For every patriotic man, and there will be many who will flock to the banner, there will be a lot more who will just simply say, yeah, that's all nice and good, but I think we're going to stay out of it. We're not going to get ourselves involved into this conflict. And so for Americans, the American Congress and the Wilson administration, the answer has to be conscription. Conscription is synonymous with the draft. We need a draft of men to come into the Army. And so the first draft in 1917 is going to be fairly limited in scope. Eventually they widen it out, limited in the sense that the age was from 21 to 35. Eventually they drop that down to 18 and push it all the way up to about 45 or so. I would be on the top end with a wife and kids. I'd probably be stuck on home duty. But at the end of the day, you could get drafted into the Army. But thousands of men, millions of men will go in. And it's worth noting many millions of men will be excluded because of lack of teeth. That's worth mentioning right there in your notes as you take notes through this lecture, is the lack of teeth. Today we take it for granted that we have good teeth and that everyone's going to have good teeth into their 50s, 60s, maybe all their life, allowing for cavities and the occasional root canal. But it's not too long in our history that a man my age would already be missing several teeth, maybe half the teeth in my head. And it wouldn't be that long ago, just my grandparents' generation, that I would be looking at some dentures already. You're going to see dentures probably brought in. I'd be looking at dentures somewhere in my mid-50s, and that's sadly only 15 years away. Who knows how time flies, you know? But the fact is that when we talk about dental work, you don't think teeth matter that much, but you got to eat. And you eat and you grind up your food and you're able to digest it properly. And Lord knows if you're going to be marching and fighting and drilling, you're going to need a lot of food and you're going to be able to need to be able to eat. So some men were disqualified for that and various and sundry other elements. Then there were some who were just slackers. That was the common term in World War I for men who just simply didn't sign up for the draft, didn't want to be drafted, decided, maybe the war wasn't that big of a deal to them. By the way, there's no substitute program like you have in the Civil War with it because of the idea that it's not going to be a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. You want to have everybody's going to have to take a bite out of this apple. But you do have slackers, and there will be slacker raids during the war trying to draw people in and just simply drop the hammer. So we need a big army. We need to recruit an army, but more especially we need to grow an army through the draft. Many of the officers of the First World War, especially early on, some of them were infirm. The story of the first few months of the World War is not unlike the first few months of the Spanish-American War. Officers who were decrepit, officers who never were wildly out of shape, officers who never seen combat or never had thought much about it after getting out of West Point. Now they're being thrust into frontline units. Some were very competent, and others not so much. But the overall commander, I think it's worth noting right now, it's called the American Army in Europe is going to be referred to properly as the American Expeditionary Force. The American Expeditionary Force in World War I is led by John J. Pershing. His nickname is Blackjack. Blackjack Pershing has a reference to his, in the 1890s, being a captain or a commanding officer of a black cavalry outfit on the high plains. But anyways, Blackjack Pershing is your overall commander, and he really earned his stripes in Mexico, even if it wasn't the most successful thing in the world. And when he is put in command, one of the things that this new army is it's going to have to be formed up or going to have to do is they are going to have to fight as a unit. One of the things demanded of the Americans, or rather demanded of the Europeans, was we as Americans are going to fight as an army, not as an army of internationals. We are Americans, and we will have the American Expeditionary Force, American soldiers. And in World War I, the soldier is referred to as a doughboy. I think that's worth remembering right there. A doughboy is going to be is going to be led by American officers and an American general. Wilson was insistent upon it. The Secretary of State, a fellow named the Secretary of War named Newton Baker, was insistent upon it. And Pershing, whose backbone was made of iron, was also insistent upon it. And the Europeans, particularly the French and the British, they were aghast at that. They basically said, give us your boys, we'll put them into our armies, we'll train them up, and when later you're ready to go, we'll let your boys out. Give us your boys so we can fight with them and train them, show them the way, because we know what's going on. And in a sense, they did. But the argument from the Americans was that basically you've gotten your own boys killed and you're trying to sideline us when the war is over so we don't have an influence at the table. No. That's just that's not going to happen. So for the most part, with a few exceptions here and there, for the most part, American soldiers are going to be in the American Expeditionary Force led by an American general and American officers. It is a unique operation. The Army is extraordinarily diverse. And it reflects the diversity of the nation coming through, because we're still in the middle of, or right at the end of, but we're still in that great migration I've referenced in class on several occasions. You have units that are sometimes made up of individuals who are in the National Guard, old Army units, if you want to call it that, and then recruit divisions. And then eventually it spreads out and it's mix and mash and who knows what. The reality is that we are, in many respects, starting from scratch. We don't have good recruit depots. Sometimes the boys are loaded up on trains and taken to this camp or that camp, and the camp is literally out in the middle of an open field. And you have perhaps wood set up, and the first thing you do is not drill. The first thing you do is you build a barracks. Other cases, perhaps the barracks is existing, but there's no uniforms. The American uniform was just basically a knockoff, with a few exceptions here and there, but a knockoff of the British uniform. The American helmet was more or less the British Tommy helmet. We call it the Kelly helmet, but that helmet's more or less theirs. Our weaponry, more or less, is a British weapon, and much of the weaponry is either French or British. American weaponry was just simply, it took too long to tool up. Our boys need training, and they need guns. In training, oftentimes they were carrying around wooden broomsticks or just wooden guns and trying to train that way. A lot of bayonet practice, but in the First World War, bayonets don't get you very far. The fact is, though, with the American Army being trained up, many of the officers themselves, the ones who were being recruited in and turned into officers, many of them could be called, what some were called in that time period, uh, let's say 90-day wonders. 90-day wonders. Basically meaning that they went through some sort of officer candidacy school, OCS, and they became an officer. And some officers didn't even have that, and they're literally reading the manual of how to drill soldiers while drilling the soldiers. It was that much of a haphazard experience. It's going to cost people their lives. When it's all said and done, the United States is going to lose approximately 117,000 men to battlefield death. Plus, also, you're going to see about 300,000 to 400,000 more wounded, some very grievously, in the battles that we participate in the First World War. But the Army is very diverse, and one of the things that I've often remarked upon, and I thought was very wise of the Army, was basically, officially anyways, there's going to be little slips here and there sort of deal, but officially and for the most part, the U.S. Army conducted its operations in the English language. It insisted upon a unified singular language, and basically what the idea was is that we've got to have some clear communications. Most of the officers are going to be speaking English, maybe others not so much. Certainly the enlisted or drafted men, that'll be a bit of a mixed bag. So some of these guys, they knew very little English, and so they had to learn it on the fly. Something else that some of these men had never been a part of is using a bathroom. And in the Army, the last thing you need is a bunch of men to be defecating and having evacuations wherever they feel. So they have to learn to not use the back of a fence as a latrine. You have to dig latrines. And so the militarization of the Army, getting these doughboys into fighting shape, is a rigorous affair and sometimes extraordinarily boring. Because early on, some of it was just simply drill and march, march and drill, and then sleep and drill some more the next day. But you got to build them up. So that's on the in the Army before they get sent across. And like I said, you're going to have several million American soldiers at the height of the transatlantic transit. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of men, 200,000 and 300,000 men per month going across the Atlantic Ocean and doing so safely. The reason they were able to go across the ocean safely, by the way, was because you developed convoys, a convoy system that was able to penetrate and frankly was able to protect those convoy ships going across. A few transport ships were sunk, but most weren't. The vast majority were not. It was not overly dangerous going across the Atlantic Ocean. So that was a failure of the German U-boats. On the home front, Woodrow Wilson is not a friend of civil rights. Woodrow Wilson was a lot of things, and a civil libertarian in wartime was not that. In fact, he made the remark, he said, if you thought Lincoln was tough on civil rights, wait till you see what we're done with us. And in the war, the fervency and the zeal of a lot of Americans was off the charts anyways. It was a super patriotism that's hard to belie and hard to communicate even to this day. Some of you probably are familiar with and have heard such things as freedom fries. Freedom fries. Because back in the Iraq War of the early 2000s, there were some super patriots who said because the French were opposing us in war, then therefore we need to stop calling them French fries, but we'll call them freedom fries. Well, if you want to think about it, what German foods are out there? How about sausage? You may not call it sausage. You may call it perhaps a Liberty dog. You even get the names of like Liberty cabbage, which is for sauerkraut. You'll see towns have their names changed. And in some cases, one little Indiana town went so far as to declare all dogs that were of German descent, if you can have a dog of German descent, but basically like a Dachshund or a Wiener dog or something of that nature. All dogs that were of German descent, not good American or British or Anglo extraction, those dogs were rounded up and shot. Also, some states banned the speaking of German, and they banned the teaching of German. Texas considered that, and other states went ahead and frankly did it. But you're going to have a whole panoply of things that was designed to bring unity, and woe unto you if you question the war effort. One of the individuals who questioned the war effort quite vigorously, and probably he was doing so, he was not calling for a rebellion, but he was saying that the war was unjust, was a fellow named Eugene V. Debs, Debs. Debs is going to run for president about half a dozen times, and at one point in time, he was a serious contender for president of the United States. In 1920, he runs from jail because Woodrow Wilson had him tossed into the pokey for violating the sedition acts of espionage and sedition acts of 17 and 18. Eugene Debs is a chief example of it, but you're going to see preachers who are pacifistic in nature get thrown into jail. You'll see other preachers, by the way, who are going to say it is our God-given right, and it is by God's grace that we as Americans, and they will basically conflate Jesus, the Bible, and the flag all together. And basically get kind of wound up and even sell Liberty bonds from the pulpit. It can get kind of extreme on both sides. But you'll see preachers arrested for being against the war. In fact, the one guy preaching from the pulpit up, I believe in New Jersey, said he was against the war. He was in his pulpit, and he was thrown in jail. Even a oh, what was it? It was a movie that was produced in Hollywood. They're all silent features at that time period, but this movie produced in Hollywood that was supposed to be pro-war was canceled and was prevented from going out, basically because there was a fear that it was anti-war, even though the director's like, I'm too old and too infirm to fight, yet I'm in favor of the war and I want to help the war. Well, if you wonder what the name of the movie was, it was called The Spirit of 76. It was a movie about American independence in the American independent war effort. The Revolutionary War, call it that. Well, you'd think that would be an innocuous and a good patriotic movie to have being played and pumped out by Hollywood. The problem is that, well, sure, that sounds great and that sounds good. But who are you fighting in the American independence movement? Who's the Revolutionary War against? Well, the answer is the British, and American censors shut that down. By the way, it could be very censorious. There was the George Creel and his committee for public information. They weren't afraid to lock people up and shut them down in the process. And so Wilson and his administration was very harsh on civil rights. If you thought that perhaps the old Bush administration was hard on civil rights, and I don't personally, but you got to go read up on Woodrow Wilson. He and his boys, they brooked no dissent, and that could get you in jail. And frankly, there were a lot of folks who were willing to snitch as well. They were ready to rat them out. It was a hyper partisan era and a hyper patriotic era during the war, and it's going to have some legacies that we'll discuss in a later lecture. But once the boys get overseas, let's go back to the war now. But once the boys get overseas, they are trained, but frankly, they're not prepared for what they're about to get into. The American rifle, which was basically an Americanized Enfield, was a good rifle. The American pistol was an okay pistol, but everything after that was going downhill quickly. We Americans believed that one of the issues the French had and the British had is that they were too cautious. They were not aggressive. If you just throw in some good old-fashioned American know-how and American grit and guts, the French call it élan. If we just have an American's guts in there, we're going to be able just to overrun the Germans and show those Europeans how to fight. So attack, aggressiveness, recklessness was the name of the game for the American tactics and strategies in the war. In March and April of 1918, and it carries into the early summer months of 1918, the Germans are going to launch a series of offensives trying to break the British and the French before the American army is able to get across the ocean. We'd already had several 100,000 soldiers get there, but it was just dribbling in. It won't the real flood of doughboys coming in. By the way, did I ever say that? I don't think I ever say why a doughboy was named as such. Well, frankly, my answer is we don't know, but some say it's because the button on the jacket looks like a piece of dough. Who knows? Anyways, the boys, they may be, the doughboys, they're in that spring offensive of the Germans. Two units come to the forefront and are going to make a name for themselves for their tenacity and recklessness in fighting. The Germans were impressed by the tenacity. They weren't impressed by the recklessness. They thought it was foolhardy, and the Americans could be handled. The problem was the Germans were running low on good quality soldiers. They had lost a lot in the war, and it was kind of ground down. But the two battles that are worth noting, well, the first one is an Army battle, a U.S. Army division, the Third Army, the third Army, excuse me, the Third Infantry Division, and it picked up a nickname for how hard and tenacious it fought in ending up against the Marne River in 1918. It was called later on the Rock of the Marne, and the battle is Chateau Thierry. Chateau Thierry is where the Rock of the Marne American fighting grit was shown forth. If you got friends and family who are in or thinking about going into the Marine Corps, the Marines are very good about teaching their own history. And one of the things they teach is a great pantheon of battles. One of those battles that they are very fond of and proud of is the Battle of Belleau Wood. The Marine Corps in 1918 is not a big outfit. It's all of about 10,000 men. The Marines were not loved by the Americans and more by the American Army, and some of the Marines had been kind of doled out and ladled out amongst some French outfits. The Battle of Belleau Wood is one in the pantheon of Marine Corps lore. Is a particularly famous engagement. It's up there with Iwo Jima. It's up there with Okinawa. It's up there with the Chosin Reservoir, excuse me, and perhaps the halls of Moctezuma in Mexico City. Well, anyways, the fact is that about half of the Marine Corps is going to be shot down in and around Belleau Wood over the span of about 3 weeks worth of fighting. It was some brutal and tenacious hand-to-hand combat, and the American censoring of the soldiers, the Army soldiers, American Expeditionary Force soldiers' letters back home and blackouts on news reports by accident did not apply to the Marines. And the Marines were given great publicity and grit and so forth. And they became very famous. And by the way, the legacy of that is in World War II, the Army made sure that the Marines were nowhere close to Europe in World War II for all intents and purposes, and that the Marines would be shunted off to the Pacific to deal with the Japanese. That if there was going to be glory for defeating Germany, it would be the Army that received it, not those damned Marines. But one of the famous statements by a Marine Corps general, or officer anyways, who was in the thick of the fighting, wasn't a general, I think it was a colonel perhaps, his men were pinned down and they were under withering fire from the German machine guns. American tactics attacking machine guns were fairly primitive and frankly pretty reckless, which is not a good recipe. But this officer whose men were pinned down needed to be encouraged. And basically goes like this is, come on, you bastards, do you want to live forever? And more or less he gets up and leads his men. But it was a tenacious set of fighting. But the German offensive by the early summer of 1918 had petered out. They ran out of troops. They ran out of supplies. The Germans were in dire straits. They're exhausted. Now the question is, how do we knock them out? How do we wreck them out? And for American participation in the First World War, the crowning moment appears and happens at the end of the war. And it happens with the what's called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. And it occurs from September 26, 1918 until November 11th, 1918. Those dates, especially November 11th, 1918, you probably ought to know. But the Meuse-Argonne Offensive is the largest battle ever organized, put together, and fought by the U.S. Army in American history. And that, my recollection, is true to this day. Single offensive, it's a big thing. It is a tenacious, aggressive, harsh gruesome fighting day after day, attack and die, everything that you could imagine that could be so bad about warfare in the First World War was there on the battlefield in the Meuse Argonne. And the Meuse Argonne is a river valley, but it is a densely thick wood. It is it's a forest basically with lots of underbrush, and it's lots and lots of good German machine gun nest. They know what they're doing. Some of those old machine gunners in the German army, they are some grizzled old hard men who perhaps just have I won't say a death wish, but they know they may not survive the war. But they know how to set their nest up, and they know how to create enfilading fire, crossfire, as it were, and a lot of our boys attack and die. It is harsh stuff, and you'll see things that men will never forget. They'll be gassed. The artillery shells are terrific. It is all, to quote a Civil War veteran, it's all that devils could hope for. Men on the battlefield, there are the days of the Meuse Argonne. They will find God. Others will meet God. Others will lose God. It is as tenacious and hellish a fighting that I've ever read about in American history in many respects. It has been overshadowed by the Battle of the Bulge or the Tet Offensive or things of later vintage. Perhaps Gettysburg, because of it being Gettysburg or something like that, has overshadowed it. But the Meuse Argonne is coming up on its 100th anniversary as I record this, and it is one of the great killing fields, one of the great decisive battles in American history, and our boys those doughboys pay a very high cost. Some become heroes out of it, and some are flashes in the pan. Others, it just breaks them, and so on. To be honest about the Meuse Argonne's going to make some men into not necessarily heroes, but it'll help make their careers. One example for the Second World War is a guy named George Patton. Many of you know Patton from the movie that made him famous. Others, like John J. Pershing, is going to receive a 5th and perhaps even a 6th star because of the Meuse Argonne. The Meuse Argonne is going to also make, because of his organizational and directing prowess, George Marshall a prominent and indispensable man in this war. Douglas MacArthur, another general. In fact, actually, MacArthur, Marshall, and Pershing. Pershing is going to be retired after the war is over, but all three of those men earn a 5th star, partially because of their time in the Meuse Argonne. Other men who are either of very poor vintage, meaning they're coming out of a poor and primitive background. Others because they came out of a very high and cosmopolitan background, will become heroes. Two names that come to mind rather quickly: Charles Whittlesey, he of the Lost Battalion. Charles Whittlesey's battalion is going to be absolutely decimated, get cut off from their 77th Division, and that Statue of Liberty Division is going to attack to relieve them. They go into this Charlevoix wooded area, a real thick, dense area, and they're going to hold on for 5-6 days with basically no food, very little water. And they go in with something like 600 men, and they come out with like less than 200. It was a gruesome affair. Whittlesey is hailed a hero, and he receives the Medal of Honor for it. So were some of his officers, some of his men who didn't speak much, if any, English, are going to get service crosses for their valor. It's not just for what you do to save a life, but the Service Cross and the Medal of Honor can be given for valor and in combat. It's not thought of that way anymore, but what do you do under fire to kill the enemy, in addition to perhaps saving a life, going above and beyond the call. But they did it. Whittlesey, after the war is over, is racked by guilt and doubt about the wisdom of his campaign, what he did there. And he's going to live a very short and tortured life. He will kill himself in a drowning suicide in about 1921. He was never the same. But that's part of the Meuse Argonne offensive. By the way, some of his men were gassed. Some of the men met what you can call flamethrowers. Those flamethrowers were hellish things. And then another man who was early in his life was a hellraiser. There's no two ways to describe it. He was a young hellion. He meets God, almost like Martin Luther in a thunderstorm, becomes a devout, pacifist, fundamentalist, hard-shell Baptist-type individual from the mountains of East Tennessee, East Kentucky, Virginia, all that little Appalachian hillbilly territory. The man's name is Alvin York. Alvin York, after his religious conversion, he did not drink, he did not smoke. He was very much a straight-laced individual, and he claimed to be a pacifist, and he was. There's no two ways about it. He tried to stay out of the war on grounds of pacifism, but he wasn't a Quaker, and so perhaps even if he was a Quaker, they wouldn't have allowed him to go. In fact, there were some who were even more strongly anti-war in the sense they were pacifist, are going to be put in jail and tortured to death for all intents and purposes by those who said that there cannot be any pacifist. That cannot be a legitimate objection. Well, anyways, Alvin York goes into combat, and he's going to personally shoot down something like 24 Germans. Maybe it was closer to 20. Between him and about half a dozen other American doughboys, they capture something like 160 German prisoners. Now, is it conceivable that, say, 12 or 13 American doughboys could easily capture 120, 160, 100, whatever exactly was, German prisoners? In normal times? Frankly, the answer is no. There are too many Germans and not enough Americans. But what that ought to tell you is that the Germans were ready to quit. But Alvin York, by the way, will go through the war. He'll be a hero. He'll receive the Medal of Honor for it as well. But his conscience will whip him the rest of his life. He never degenerates into drunkenness or anything like that. But he dies in about 1963, 64, 62 or 63, excuse me. And at the end of his life, he is delinquent on taxes. He's a very primitive man, and the war was not good for him. Others, it makes him. So the First World War, and especially the Meuse-Argonne offensive, will be the proving ground for many, many men, and it will be the thing by which that they will always measure themselves the rest of the way. In fact, actually, one of Harry Truman, future president of the United States, one of his proudest accomplishments was being an artillery chieftain, an artillery captain in the First World War, and it was one of his crowning moments of his life. That's not unusual in warfare. Many people see combat as the crowded hour, to borrow Theodore Roosevelt's phrase that is out there. Well, anyways, but it is a brutal affair. And by the time you get to the first week of November 1918, American advances, though bloody, had been solid. British and French attacks, though bloody, had been solid as well. It was obvious that Austria had collapsed and was falling apart. Germany was collapsing internally. German men and women hadn't had good food in years. In fact, there was starvation in Germany. I didn't tell the story earlier, perhaps I should have, but one of the things that if you ever wanted to make a cake in Germany in 1918, you substituted flour with finely ground wood chips, finely ground powder. It was brutal, and the German morale finally broke in 1918, and Germany starts to collapse from the inside. There are general riots. There's worries about a Bolshevik takeover in Germany. The communists are on the move. Germany just is falling apart. And by about, I believe it was November 10th, November 9th, the German Kaiser abdicated. Well, the German government had been sending out feelers to the United States for several weeks, if not a month, prior to the end of the war on November 11th, because the American president Woodrow Wilson is going to issue what he's called the 14 points for peace. It has some bearing on the end of the war. Certainly, the League of Nations will be there, but at the same time, it is Wilson's idealistic hopes for dreams for a war that ends all war. And that, by the way, was another phrase that was attributed to Wilson, the war to end all wars. But it probably wasn't him. But the fact was a lot of Americans, especially a lot of Europeans, a lot of Germans, had basically thrown their hands up and said, let this be the last war. The Germans surrender, and more particularly the word you probably ought to put in your notes is called an armistice on, November 11th. At the 11th hour of the 11th month, and supposedly at the 11th minute, the guns fall silent. The war is over. Germany quits. And pandemonium breaks out in all the victorious nations. Frankly, the war is over, and we win. Now, what did you win? At the time, perhaps you think that the war is going to end all war, that no one could ever conceive of wanting to go to war again. It was so horrible and so gruesome and so bloody that the only person or only species that could have hoped for war would be a buzzard or a rat. But we know, of course, history doesn't work that way, and war still goes on to this present day, but especially World War II in world history and American history. But there was hope, great hope and joy. When in early 1919, when Woodrow Wilson travels to Europe to attend the Paris Peace Conference, the Versailles Peace Conference, when Wilson travels through Paris, over 1 million individuals. I've seen reports it was up to 3 million. But millions of individuals wanted to see Wilson because they thought of him as almost like a messiah figure. And Wilson, who had an ego the size of Blinn College's, the campus of Blinn College in Brenham, the fact is that Wilson was he thought he had a right to play in the treaty negotiations, and and I think he did. But Wilson was also a sick man. He had a bad heart, but more especially, he had a hardening of the arteries. He had hypertension. It was going to lead to a stroke and break him physically. He had worked himself to death, and like many men who are president and are also during the war, during a wartime, you see them age immeasurably, and it was true with Wilson. Eventually, he'll have a massive stroke. He's never the same again, and it helps bring down in the United States Senate the League of Nations Treaty. There's a whole lot more that can be said about that. You can read in your textbook on that account. But the war was over. Americans were ready to bring the boys home. Some came back right away. Others had to spend detailed duty in Germany for a little bit of time. But the treaty of the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 is going to be one of the things that helps sow the seeds of the Second World War. The Germans are going to be, the Germans, especially those who are of later Nazi vintage, are going to believe that Germany had been stabbed in the back, had been stabbed in back by lots of folks, and that the Treaty of Versailles was unjust to Germany, and so forth. But that brings the World War to a conclusion. The United States acquits itself honorably in the war, maybe not greatly in the sense that we fought it supremely and supremely well, but we were decisive in the war. Had it not been for America's presence, the British and French would have lost. I'm certain, I feel very certain of that, and the Germans would have won. Now, it might be asked, was it worth having Germany win? We'll see. Maybe that's a what-if in question, but that's not the way history turned out. It cost the lives of many thousands of Americans, and many thousands more will be wounded. In fact, actually, most Americans still, even in World War I, are going to die not of battlefield wounds. They're going to die, or battlefield, some sort of thing on the battlefield. They're going to die of disease. And that's also a preview of the 1918 flu epidemic, which also played a part as well. But for many, it was the defining event of their life. And that's probably about as good of a place as you can stop for a lecture like this. All right. Thank you very much.